Hey there, New Missionary Baptist Church family. It's good to be with you today via video. Just talking a little bit about the series that we're going to be doing here in January. Pastor Roy was with us this past Sunday for our World Mission Sunday, which we always do the first Sunday of the year, and it's where all the offering that was given goes directly to missions. It's nothing that is kept here unless somebody designated some money for something. We usually try to highlight our missionaries a little bit, so we had a packet that was made with our missionaries. And then for the month, what we're going to be doing is kind of directing our attention to missions of what God has called us to as Christians, as believers. You know, what is it that we are to be doing? And so Pastor Roy came and he kind of kicked off for us the series a little bit. He stayed in the chapter that we will be in, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Our focus will be from verse 11 or 12 all the way to verse 21. So we'll be spending 4 weeks in this section. One of the things, though, that Roy talked about that maybe we can talk about that I was thankful that he hit on was we can get lost sometimes when we think about missions and missionaries. We do tend to start thinking about beyond us. And so, you know, I think if you've been in church very long, you've had a missionary come to the church and they talk about what they're doing. And you can leave one of two ways usually, like, oh, that's cool of what just is happening there, and we'll be praying for that. Or two, I'm a nobody. Like, this person gave up everything and they're now overseas somewhere and just risking everything for the sake of the gospel. But it's this mentality of it being foreign, really, and not something that we do. But I did say yesterday that we need to think personally about our mission, where we are, and where we're living. You guys got any words on that? Just thinking about that in general of how, you know, so we have a new year. A lot of times people do resolutions, stuff like that. And if we're thinking we want to be doing what God would have us be doing, right? If we're thinking about that, how does missions play into that then on a daily basis for a normal Christian believer? What do you guys think?
Scott? Yeah, I think when you put it in the context like that, in terms of like New Year's resolutions and how do we put ourselves as an everyday believer in that kind of context, I think what it really comes down to is God has given a mission to the church to make disciples. And if you're a Christian, you're part of the church. And so what part are you playing in that? How are you supporting what your church is doing in your local community to be part of that disciple-making process? It's going to look different for different people based on the stages of life that they're in. I don't think it's healthy for a Christian to just take a Lone Ranger approach to being a missionary where they live. God's made you part of a fellowship of a church for a reason. And so I don't think people should take upon the weight of the world or of their community, like I have to reach my whole neighborhood with the gospel, but you should be thinking in terms of God has put my church here. It's not just churches that are planted over in Nigeria. It's churches that are planted here. Monroe Missionary Baptist Church was started, and it was started with a purpose. It might have been a long time ago, but the purpose has not changed. And so just asking the question, what role am I playing in the mission that God has given my local church, which is the same mission He's given to the universal church? Mm-hmm. What role am I playing in that?
Yeah.
And I think that's just where you need to start.
Sure.
And it can go a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Spencer, anything you want there?
Yeah, no, I think I just want I think it's important for all of us to just for all of us, when we see people come in who are called to the foreign mission field, like you were saying, or to a certain ministry, to not let that discourage us, because it's interesting. You know, you read, like, I'm looking here in 1 Peter chapter 2. He tells these Christians early on, he says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And then he says in verse 11, Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. So what he really is calling us to do, and it's interesting, if you look at the commands of the Apostle Paul or Peter to these local Christians, consistently what he's saying that he expects of us as church members are, it's interesting. It's not really crazy stuff. One of the things he says is live quietly with your neighbors, work with your hands, live honorable lives before other people. Be ready to give a witness for the hope that's within you, for why you live this way, and for why your hope is in Jesus Christ. Love your wife. Wife, love your husband. So it looks very ordinary, but that's really what we're called to as Christians. We're called to live. That's what godliness looks like. Godliness looks like a myriad of very ordinary moments, but whenever you put them together, they're a life of godliness. And so I think that we want to encourage people that we're always to be ready for the hope that's within us as we live out in the world. When we get together as the church, we're hearing Christ speak to us through the scriptures, through the preacher. But if we would focus on those things, on these very basic things, I think we would be better witnesses for Christ than if we're thinking about all the really crazy things that we could do. I have enough problems myself with trying to obey the 10 Commandments out of gratitude for grace received. That's enough for me to focus on right now, loving God and loving my neighbor. I'll focus on that, and all of us can do that in our stations, in our vocations in life, and in our various callings in life. And I think if we did that also removes some of the burden, but also it really helps me to understand that I just live a godly life right here and now.
I think so often when, like the description you gave, Tim, at the very beginning of how when a missionary would come and speak at your church, you can come away with that feeling of like, they're the super Christian. I'm the one that's kind of nothing and not doing anything with my life or whatever. But I mean, what you just said, Spencer, is really true, because the reality is most of what that person is doing on the mission field is they're simply living as a Christian. They're living as a Christian the way that God has called them to in their family, in their community, in their church context. And they're putting special focus on getting the word out to their community. And so there's really nothing special about them. Oftentimes you walk away in awe of what they're doing when really what they're doing is being faithful to what God has called them to do as a Christian.
Right.
Yeah, I know for me, when I've went on mission trips like overseas, what I've noticed in myself is how intentional I am in those to be focused on opportunities to minister to somebody, or opportunities to help somebody, or opportunities to share the gospel with somebody. Like I become very intentional in that, and I know I've noticed how that doesn't happen at home all the time, right? And so where I've seen I could do that at home, just be more intentional in my everyday life to be thinking about these things, praying about these things, focusing about these things. So there are things I think that I can learn. I've learned from doing that stuff, but it's good to see. It's not, well, now I need to go live in the Philippines because I can only do it there, right? It shouldn't be that takeaway. And I've ran into that with groups. I've taken groups overseas and stuff, and usually one in all those groups, like, yeah, God's called me to serve the people of the Philippines, or God has now called me to serve wherever we went, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe you should go on another trip and let's see what he says then. And then it's like, oh, well, now I'm supposed to serve the people of Haiti. And it's like, that's interesting. Everywhere you go, you're supposed to serve these people, right?
God's really confused, apparently.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
But there's a certain sense in which you can kind of identify with that person. Because if what you're doing there is like, that's the work that God has called Christians to do, there's something in you that feels right about this.
Sure.
Like I am doing something right in this, and I want to keep doing that. And that's where guidance needs to come in from the pastor, from your church, obviously. But I think there's a good reason why people sometimes feel like that when they go on trips. It's because this is maybe the first time as a Christian you've actually been doing some of the things that you should always be doing. And I don't want to discourage that, but it definitely needs guidance at times.
Yeah, I think the first thing that would be said, it's like, okay, you're trying to be more on mission. You want to be more focused on the things that God would have you do, I really would think the number one thing would be, well, then you need to be faithful to your church. You need to be committed to a church and faithful to that church, faithful to its services, faithful to the things that church is doing, whatever it may be, because there is a difference. I think maybe we could talk about this too a little bit, is there's a difference between the mission of an individual Christian and then the mission of a church when all the Christians come together. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of good things that Monroe Missionary Baptist Church could be a part of. There's tons of it in the world that we could give money to, send people to, help with. But there are specific things that we choose as staff, as leadership, to say, this is something we're going to latch onto. Thus, Mission Sunday. And we said, these people are ones that we're supporting. We mentioned some local community groups that we're a part of, that we have no problem helping and being a part of. But what I often get, and I'm sure you guys do too, is I'll get, Christians within our church who say, hey, we should be a part of this, or hey, I know this missionary over here that maybe we should support, or this and this and that, right? And there's all these things. And my response usually to those is, that's a good thing. Maybe you should do that. Maybe you should be a part of that. Maybe you should go help there. Now, if there's a concern, obviously saying, maybe you shouldn't be a part of that group or something. But that's an individual Christian, I would say, thing that you can go and be a part of that. You can still be a faithful member here. That's why I say that was number one. But then if you feel the need to serve in a soup kitchen that we don't necessarily send people to all the time, sure, do that on Mondays or whatever. And that's great. And if you say, well, I just feel God wants me to do this, there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But that's where I would say us coming together as a church, it's a little different, the mission, than maybe you as an individual Christian. But I would say, again, first and foremost, is, are you committed to your local church? If you're going to join the church, but then on Mondays do this soup kitchen, on Tuesdays you're doing this ministry, and now you're so busy with all of your own personal ministries and nothing your church, that's when I would start to say there's a problem here, because you're getting things kind of confused. You're getting things out of line. And I think we see this going all the way back into the Old Testament with Paul, because Paul would encourage Timothy and these pastors to create a local church and to get people in the local church. But then Paul would also ask them to support missionary endeavors at times. And it's interesting because he didn't ask them to necessarily come with him, but it was, do you mind helping financially? You've been faithful in this. And so there is a precedence then of a church not just focusing locally right here, but then expanding out into other venues. But again, Paul didn't say, and by the way, send 2 of your members here. I'm going to take 2 from each church and we're going to go do it. No, it was, Paul understood, this is my task that God has given me. And he would take people sometimes. Sure. Right? But he wasn't saying, this is your job now as the church. No, the church of Ephesus, you're in Ephesus, right? Laodicea, you guys are in these places for a reason. And so we can get confused. Maybe you mentioned this, I don't remember which one, about we make it our personal thing, right? It's our personal mission, and then we separate it from the church's mission. And I guess I'm just trying to speak to the danger of that, because that's the Lone Ranger. I think you said a Lone Ranger thing. We don't need to go down that road. We need to be faithful to the things that the church has done, because it's not just about me. And that mentality, I think, starts to come in, especially when we think, I'm a loser, that person's a phenomenal Christian. We make it very, very personalized in a way that it shouldn't be personalized. I don't know if that's making sense, what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, I think it does. I mean, that's why I said, and how does that translate to your personal life? I mean, the first question is, how can you be involved in the work that your church is doing? Make sure you're doing that first, because without that kind of fellowship that you'd be experiencing, without the brothers and sisters helping you along in whatever effort that might be, maybe your church already has a ministry that you don't know about that you could play a role in. Maybe there are current needs that your church has that would line up right along with what you feel like you want to be doing. That's the first place to start.
Yeah, it's interesting how much we minimize the blueprint that God has given us to be a faithful Christian to him. And it's stuff that we say over and over and over and over again. And it gets on people's nerves probably to hear this all the time. But when we say, you need to be in church,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be in services,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be in fellowship with each other, right? You need to be reading God's word regularly. You need to be praying regularly. You need to be faithful in your workplace, wherever you do, like be a good worker there. Like these are the things that we speak of very regularly, and even sometimes just like push it aside, like on a side note, but these are the things that God has called us to do, to be faithful witnesses, to be salt and light, as was mentioned Sunday, here on this earth. And as we do that, God works and is honored and is glorified. That's how we glorify him, is that daily grinding over, which isn't like it's pretty boring at times. You know what I mean?
It's not flashy.
It's not flashy.
I think too, creeping into this is we have this idea of what we think a good work is. And so we think that unless I'm doing something, quote, ministry, I'm not doing a good work, and it's not holy.
Sure.
And what we find creeping in then is a soft monasticism. By that I mean, like, we make fun of, as Protestants and as Baptists, we might disagree with Catholics who might have a monastery where nuns or monks go to. But we start segregating our lives that way, as if me changing my child's diaper is unholy work. All I do as a mother is I just change diapers, I do dishes, I go get groceries. That's nothing.
Yeah, what does it matter?
Well, and that's the thing, right? The Reformation freed us from that.
Mm-hmm.
That was the whole point, is now we're free. I do not have to buy my salvation anymore. Everything I do is holy. And it's holy not because of what I do, but because I'm a believer in Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That's very key, is because what you do is good now because you're first of all a believer in Christ. So so a believer and an unbeliever can do the same exact work. They can do dishes for their spouse. But for the believer, it's a good work. For the unbeliever, it's not. What makes the difference? Well, one has Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And the second of all, the thing that makes a good work is the fact that it's commanded by God. One of the things that we can be tempted to do is we make up good works.
Mm-hmm.
We start formulating, well, that's not good enough, but if I do this really big thing or this really crazy thing for the Lord, that's a good work. Well, no, the Lord never commanded you to go do that, but he did command you to go to work, punch the clock, do your best, be nice to the guy right next to you, love your wife, not be mean to your kids. He did tell you to do that. And so we start to manufacture what we think are good works in our minds. And I think it's really important for us to hone our minds back in to what God requires of us, because we start letting the world or ourselves or our past church experience or whatever start to dictate to us and lay upon our consciences what God's demanding of us. But God doesn't demand that of us.
Sure.
God commands us to trust his Son, to be grateful for what he's given to us, to strive for obedience, and to share the gospel as we have opportunity. Other than that, I cannot, as a pastor, lay any burden upon you, because God doesn't. And so I think, and also as a Christian, you need to be careful too that you don't lay more burdens on yourself than what God does. He's the Lord of you, not you.
Yeah.
And so go, and then out of that, knock yourself out. St. Augustine, your church father, said, right? Love God and do what you want.
So how could one determine, how would you counsel somebody, Scott, how would you counsel someone? Maybe someone come to you and said, hey, I feel like God is calling me to like a missions field.
Mm-hmm.
How do we work through that? Because God does do that.
Sure.
And I mean, we would say that in our own lives.
Definitely.
This calling to be a pastor and do it as a living. I mean, do it full time somewhere. That was a hard process, I know, for me to go through, to think in my mind, to wonder, am I thinking that I'm something special that I'm having to do that? Like it was a lot of tension. I remember at the time. So how do we, we've talked, I think, pretty faithfully about most Christians, right. 98%, whatever that percentage is, 99% of people who live your life faithfully of what you're doing, right? Okay. But how do you counsel maybe those that come to you and say, I think God might be calling me to be a missionary or to be a pastor or whatever else it might be? How do we walk through that well so that we can maybe root out those who are just seeking some special office, and root out and then pull up the ones who we really do see that calling?
Yeah. I think what Spencer said and what he was just talking about is like we live in this way and then we share the gospel as we have opportunity. What I've noticed and what I think everybody will notice throughout their life is that the times where you are living faithfully as a Christian in the way that God has commanded you to, opportunities seem to find a way to you. They seem to happen more often when that happens. And I think some of that is God's providence working that out. I think a lot of it too is if you're reading your Bible consistently, if you're fellowshipping with the church consistently and other believers, if you're thinking of God and the work that you're doing, God is going to be on your mind. And you're going to notice an opportunity sooner than what you would have if you had not read your Bible in months or not been to church in a month. You know, it's just going to happen. And so the opportunities will be more consistent the more you are living your life as a Christian should live. And but that I say that because I think that does tie into the question of person comes to me as a pastor, says, Pastor, I think God's calling me to go on the mission field or to be part of this mission. The organization that I used to work for before I came here, 20 Schemes, when we would have people apply to be 2-year interns or to be a church planter over in Scotland, one of the first things that we would do as an organization is get in touch with the pastors of their church that they are a member of and ask them, is this person doing this work already? Are they evangelizing their neighbors? Are they living faithfully as a Christian? Are they a good husband? Is this person a good wife? You know, are they an obedient child to their parents? We want to know, are you already doing the work here that you would be doing overseas? Because like I said earlier, not really much is going to change about that. You're going to do the same stuff. And so to that person, one of the ways I guess you try to figure out, like, is this person just living in fantasy land about what this is going to be like, is you figure out, are you already doing this stuff where you are? And if you're not, then you probably should not be a missionary at this point. Maybe it's time for us to do a little bit of discipleship and work through that here and now. I think that's where you start, at least in that place. That's really good.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's good to talk to people in their local church. Now, if it's somebody in our church, I think what Scott said about, first of all, I mean, are you there are certain characteristics, I don't think it's necessarily meant to be like an exhaust. I think that what Paul gives us is a template. This is the kind of person you're looking for, right? As far as elders and deacons, you're looking for somebody who's Christ-like in their behavior. And that's the first thing. Second, and that's going to happen as you work with other pastors and the church and other people. But also, I think then if they're the kind of person that we would say is living a Christ-like life and can do this. Second of all, I mean, of course, is the question of, well, can you do this now? Are you gifted to do this? And some people can have good intentions and good motives and love the Lord, but perhaps the Lord hasn't gifted them to do whatever that specific ministry is, particularly in, I mean, you can't get around it. Christianity is a religion of the word. So if you're going to be spreading the gospel, you have to be able to teach it and communicate it at some level. It's a message. So if we're talking specifically about that, so then for me in my own case, and I'll use myself as an example at this part.
You're a pastor's kid, so it was predetermined.
Yeah. That's
the title was just passed on, the crown taken off.
It really wasn't. But then I think it gets to the point. Well, if you want to do this, go and take the proper steps. So for me, for instance, in my situation, that meant going to seminary. Go to get some training, schooling. But then at the very end, I think the important thing is for them to understand, is for all of us to understand that really we're not sure that you're called to the ministry until a local church calls you or whatever group until God specifically and objectively calls you to that. You're not called to the ministry officially in a real sense, right? And so I think that's really where I would want to encourage them to take the steps along this pathway, because you can go to Bible college, you can go to seminary, whatever this looks like, and you're not going to waste your time there. God doesn't waste our time, even if you at the very end realize, maybe this isn't for me, maybe it's not. That's okay, and let people be okay with that. But also just realizing that the ultimate that you're walking a journey, and eventually the Lord in His providence may shut that down. Maybe you're going to find out I'm not going to get satisfaction out of this, because really a lot of people that go into ministry are not going to find personal job satisfaction out of ministry, and that's okay. You shouldn't feel guilty about that. Very few do. And so then also I think just to remind yourself that you're not objectively called until a local church or group calls you.
I think one of the things that's, to me, noticeable that we keep coming back to in this conversation is what we've already said, the connection between an individual Christian's ministry, whether they're going into missions, starting a new church, participating in this other thing, and the connection between that individual Christian and the role of their local church. And those two they have to be in sync with each other. I mean, one of the most, I don't know if I'd call it dangerous, but unfortunate things is a Christian who does that Lone Ranger thing because, like, if they're not gifted or they're not living a godly life to where they're not qualified for this kind of ministry in their character, what they're actually going to go out and do is a lot of damage in the kingdom of God. They're going to spread something about Christianity, but it's not going to be the message that we want spread and about salvation, and instead of seeing the kingdom grow, it's going to cause some damage to people that they'll interact with.
Yep.
So,
yeah, and I mean, in Romans it talks about how the gospel is spread, but it says unless they are sent out to share. And you guys said this, the local church, I think, becomes very important in this calling on people's lives. We call it a calling, to where the reason God puts us into the church He puts us in, I think, is for a reason, and part of that is the leadership that is there. And if you join a church and you're a member of a church, you fall under that leadership that you have joined. You've submitted to them, and hopefully that leadership is caring for you, is loving for you, is feeding you spiritually, doing these things that they are supposed to be doing. And so, to me, that's the natural place to go first. I mean, you might go to your parents or a spouse or something. Obviously, you would do that, and that's one thing I would say for sure. If spouses can't agree, it's probably you shouldn't do it, right? If you want to move to Bolivia and she doesn't, you probably shouldn't, right? That's a problem there. But I think then one of the first places is you go to your local church and you go to the leadership there and let them be honest with you. And then that falls on the leadership to be honest. I think a lot of bad things could have been averted if leaders would have had the guts to tell people, I don't think you're qualified for this. Like what you had said, it's a hard conversation to have with somebody who is a great person, who loves the Lord, and you tell them, listen, you couldn't teach anybody anything. I mean, you're not going to be that rude, but it's like, you don't teach that well. You know what I'm saying? That's a hard conversation to have somebody in a real loving way to say, I don't think this is the gift God has gifted you with. Because a lot of times when that person finally has the guts to come to the pastor, they're pretty confident that they know that this is where it's happening. And when they then hear...
And usually they're not asking the pastor what they think. They're saying, Pastor, God's called me to this. I'm going to go do it.
Right.
That's unfortunate.
Right. No, you're right. And I just don't think that's how it needs to be. And oftentimes what I've seen is I feel like through prayer and stuff and just witnessing things, you see God moving in somebody and it's like, they're really good at this. Like I could see them in ministry, or I could see them as a missionary. I could see this. And usually what I've come across more often than not in successful endeavors is people saying, I don't know, like you bring it up to them almost like, have you ever thought about teaching a class on your own? I don't know. I just really don't know if I'm good enough. And no, I think you could be. Like, I really think good. And I've seen that be more successful nudging them along than the guy who busts in the office. Hey, I'm here to teach.
I'm here to bless all of you.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't know. And I mean, I've had to have those conversations numerous times with people. Like, I feel called to preach. No, I don't think so. Well, why not? I feel it. Like I feel this burden to go and preach. And because I don't think you're a good preacher. Like, I don't think you have this ability and this gift. But again, that's why it falls to the local church. Point one of what we've said all along.
Right.
If you want to be on mission for God, you be a part of a local church and faithful there.
And that's where, too, it comes, what you were talking about, Spencer, comes into play, because that person who came in so confident that God's called me to preach, God's called me to move to this area to be an outpost of the kingdom, like if they don't have the good understanding that you were talking about of God has called me to live as a faithful Christian, and this is what that looks like, then they could be easily crushed, and like their spirit of like, well, what now? What am I supposed? If I can't preach, what am I to God?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, you matter a great deal, and the ministry that you already have matters a great deal. I mean, so just for example, like Christians wanting to find opportunities for how to be a more bold witness for the gospel. It's like, do you have kids in your home? If they're young, they're probably not Christians. If they're really young, or like if they're teenagers, it takes a lot of boldness to sit down with a teenager, let alone your teenager, and tell them about the gospel and to be a faithful witness in that way. Yet, I think unfortunately most parents don't do that. You don't have to be super formal and weird about it, but a lot of parents are not faithfully telling their own children about the gospel of Christ. And so you have opportunities all around you that God has already worked into your life that you can use, and sometimes it'll take years for that to show any fruit, but that's where God's called you to do that.
Yeah, and when we look at the things that I'm talking about, of like teaching and preaching and stuff, there's not one of those in every church, like just one. There needs to be multiples of those in churches. And so a lot of times I think someone is better served to stay in their church and teach there. Like you said, serve there, teach there, have a Sunday school class or have a small group or come alongside your pastor and let him give you opportunities to do these different things. There's not this need necessarily to have to go out on your own. And like, I think that's people trying to make a name for themselves, honestly, in the kingdom of heaven. And that's not what our task is. Our task is to glorify his name, right? And to honor him. And so, it's a tough thing. I think I don't want to make it sound easy when there's a lot of people maybe right now in between jobs or getting ready to go to college or getting out of college, and you're making some big decisions. I'm not trying to minimize the decisions, and I'm not trying to we're not trying to say just do whatever you like and God will be happy with it. I'm not saying that either. We're saying use your head, use wise counsel from people that you would trust, but also your church family.
Right.
Let them pray for you.
Right.
And then make the best decision from there and understand that you're being faithful to God when you do that.
Yeah.
Probably regardless of the decision you make. I mean, unless you're choosing a really sinful occupation versus...
Well, God doesn't expect us to find his secret will.
Yeah, there's not some...
and that's the
problem. If I would have did door A,
right.
Everyone would be a Christian right now probably, but I chose B.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I recently listened to a sermon on Luke 22, 24 through 30, where Jesus is sitting down with his disciples at the Last Supper, and there's a dispute that comes up over who is the greatest of them. And Jesus says to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at the table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I assign to you, as my Father assigned to me, a kingdom, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. But the idea there is that Jesus saying the greatest among you is the one who serves. If you, as a Christian, want to be used in God's kingdom, what you really just need to do is come to a place of ministry and say, where can I serve? Where can I be the least here? And whose feet can I wash? How can I serve? That's a different attitude than coming and saying, I'm going to go preach. I'm going to be the main guy on the stage. That's what God's calling me to do. When really, sometimes what you just need to do is you need to go somewhere where ministry is already happening and say, where can I help? What do you need help with? And let Let that opportunity come to you. Just
Right.
make yourself available. Let the opportunity come to you instead of you making the decision about what you are going to do beforehand. And I
Right.
think you'll find a lot more opportunities for ministry.
Mhm.
And you'll probably find the opportunities for ministry that you're actually better at in that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, where we're headed in this series, like I said, is I'm in Romans right now, but is in 2 Corinthians 5, verses like 11 or 12 through 21, and just what we'll spend time looking at is our motivation in missions is the love of Christ. The love that He has shown us is what causes us to, number one, love Him, number two, love others how we're supposed to. We have many places in Scripture we could go to where God tells us how to interact with each other, and it's all based off of the love that Christ has for us. And so we'll see that. We're going to talk about what it means new creation versus old creation, because it talks about in there. Pastor Roy talked about this a little bit Sunday, but we'll talk about this as well. Reconciliation, that word reconciliation, how we've been reconciled to God and how we then try to see others reconciled to God, how God has blessed us with the ability to do that, to introduce people to Him, and how God will use that and use His word then to save them by His grace. But then also at the end there of that chapter, it talks about ambassadors for Christ, which really is a really good mental picture of what we are to be here. And so that's what we're going to be talking about all through January, focusing on missions and what it means to be on mission for Christ right here where we live in Monroe as a church and as individual Christians. So maybe you'll have a chance to read that, study that a little bit on your own. But like I said, we'll be in that the rest of this month, which is 4 more weeks, because there's 5 Sundays in January. So look forward to doing that. And after that, we're going to be in Ephesians. We're going to go through Ephesians this year together with a couple other little things throughout the year. So looking forward to it. Thank you guys for sharing. Thank you for being with us. Hope you have a good week. God bless.